the Catherine Kerr Memorial Series on vital energy and health and healing. This is a lecture series that's now been going on for about 2.5 years, where we explore vital energy and its uses in healing practices, including its history and its application in practice, and also different clinical and scientific studies of the potential of these vital energy healing techniques to improve the lives of people all around the world, going back to oftentimes very ancient ideas and discoveries and using those to bring benefit to those of us alive today. And it's my great honor today to welcome back for a second talk, Dr. Heiner Fruhauf, who is one of the foremost experts in Chinese medicine, and not just the sort of the modern version of TCM of traditional Chinese medicine, which is very informed by modern scientific methods and is kind of fit into, which he'll be talking about at great length today. But he's an expert in what he calls classical Chinese medicine, the real traditional techniques passed down from teachers to students, master disciple lineages, going all the way back to some of the earliest times in China. This is our great honor, as I mentioned, to have Dr. Fruhauf coming to us to speak for a second time. He actually gave our inaugural lecture back in 2020 on the history of the concept of qi and the theories surrounding it. So if that's something you're interested in, that lecture is actually recorded, as this lecture is going to be. And you can go to see it at through the Contemplative Studies at Brown website. We have a special link, and we'll be posting a link to that in the chat if you're interested. And I definitely recommend taking a look at that if you enjoy the talk today and you'd like to learn more. He's a fantastic speaker, and we're very, very happy to have him. So I'm not going to take up any more time because I'm looking forward to this lecture. And so I'd like to, all of us to welcome Dr. Heiner Fruhauf to speak with us today.
Thank you so much, Larson, for the invitation and the kind introduction. I love speaking at this venue. I think it's a wonderful platform for the exploration and people from different disciplines coming together and different fields to look at energy medicine. I also want to thank my friend and colleague, Professor Hal Roth, for suggesting this particular topic that I hadn't touched in over 20 years. And it's been great fun to get back into it. And I'm glad we'll have a record, thanks to you, of that, because this is always something I want to talk to my own students about that. And since people read less and less and watch recorded lectures more and more, maybe this will be more popular than some buried article there. I will share my screen now. So I'll try ambitiously to go over 200 years of history and how Chinese medicine during that time has changed. And please forgive me if it'll be a little bit of a cartoonized presentation where, like I take an item that is worth a doctoral dissertation in its own right, and I go over that in one simplified slide there in 1 minute. I also should, in spirit of full disclosure, should say I was trained as a sinologist, but I'm not presenting here as a historian or as an anthropologist, but really as a clinician of Chinese medicine. And that means I show up here with my biases that I'm, not an external observer, but I'm in the field. I'm using this medicine to practice and have pretty strong opinions about how this medicine should be, because I'll be presenting basically arguments from two sides of the field that have both influenced our medicine, how it's being practiced and taught and nowadays, but I definitely have very clear preferences there, and want to mention that right at the very beginning. In this lecture of a brief history of Qi that Larson kindly referred to, I sort of presented the Qi philosophy of Chinese medicine, that it's basically from the very beginning in the oracle, from the very beginning of Chinese writing during the Shang dynasty in 3,500 years ago, we have this focus on bioelectromagnetism, you could say, this kind of solar streaming of life-giving energy that comes down from the sky, that enervates everything, that informs everything, that moves everything, and that in diagnosis and therapy is the primary focus of this medicine. In the Huangdi Neijing itself, the classic of Chinese medicine, there is these greatly, differentiation of qi in nature in all kinds of different cycles, culminating in the Qi Pian Da Lun, the 7 great treatises that lay out the 6-year cycle, which is fairly interesting because from a pandemic perspective, particularly right now, we all might know somebody who's actually, even though the pandemic is supposed to have finished, who is sick right now. There is a very extreme energetic pattern right now from the middle of May to the middle of September, according to this ancient, really 3,000 plus year system that we find recorded in the Neijing from 2,000 years ago. Shaoyang in the heaven right now, Shaoyang in the at the source, and the guest qi is also Shaoyang. So we have like an abundance of an excess of a particular type of fire energy there in nature right now. At the middle of the Han Dynasty, we even have ritual linking of macrocosm and microcosm, where the emperor at different months of the year would go around and do different rituals, wear different clothes, intone different chants. And, the main temple there at the imperial compound, the ancestral hall, the Mingtang, was laid out like that. We know from descriptions, and we know what kind of happened in there. And of course, on the basis of that, we have not only a musical system where you literally had a description of different vibrations at different times, at different months of the year, but you had the direct linking in the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Medicine to what the 12 or so-called organ networks of Chinese medicine are, which are really looking at the body like an instrument that has vibrations, vibrational challenge in it that co-resonate with macrocosmic vibrations. So purely energetically based. And then we have this, this has been my research for the last 20 plus years in how this concept of Tianyuan Heyi, how Chinese medicine is based on this concept of macro and microcosmic alchemy, how the above is co-resonating and informing the below. So we have this Han Dynasty science of 12 months of the year that are being described with 12 tidal hexagrams that go with 12 stellar houses, that go with the 12 earthly branches, etc., but that go with 12 different rivers in the sacred landscape of China, but also go with the 12 meridian systems in the body. And here in this chapter 11 in the Ling Shu, this is directly, these elements are directly linked to each other and are therefore game for us to decode. The Neijing, of course, doesn't explain exactly what, other than saying the rivers. A lot of it is just, basically the Neijing says, if you fully want to understand that, you need to find a teacher and get the rest of this in oral transmission. So Chinese medicine, basically, as I was introduced to it by my teachers, was the body is a landscape, is a microcosm that is co-resonating with macrocosmic energy. Yes, it has a structure, but it is mostly all of the diagnosis and treatment goes after the energy body, like it is here portrayed by Alex Gray. And even the structural portrayals that became more and more prominent during the late Ming and then the Qing dynasty of the organ systems was more functional than it was structural. The way how the organs were placed and how they were described in graphs like that is more, while it sort of is representative of what we could call Western anatomy knowledge of the body, it is more of includes the function here. Like there's this, right, there's this chapter in the Nanjing, the Classic of Difficulties, the other important classic in Chinese medicine that has Zhang Fu Du Shu, like the physical dimension of the organ networks, the Zhang and the Fu organs. And it says, you know, the gallbladder is located within the lobes of the liver, and it weighs this much, 3 liang and 3 ju, and it can contain 3 cubic units of essence water, etc. So here, highly idealized numbers that are not directly representative of the actual size, but through numerology, which was dominant at Han Dynasty times, right? When we read a Han Dynasty formula, how many grams or how many qian or so was the same thing, that the numbers are communicating functional energetic realities more so than they are communicating structural ones. The Chinese were by no means averse to the exploration of the material world. This is one of my favorite books here, is an encyclopedia of material things in ancient China, which from the stars to the, you know, like chopsticks in the Dream of the Red Chamber, everything is listed in there and in great detail. The exploration of Chinese medicine, if you say in the biggest sense of the word, is everything in Chinese medicine is about yin yang, and that is in the interplay of matter and non-matter. So Chinese medicine is hierarchically looking at energy first, but by no means is disregarding the physical structure of the body, but is always looking at what is the informative, what is the information that comes from the qi into the physical world, and how the physical world therefore waxes and wanes following the waxing and waning of the invisible qi in the macrocosm as well as in the microcosm. And so we have this map in a certain way, this interweaving of these 5 different layers of least dense Tao and Qi and symbols and physical form and physical shape at the very bottom. You know, how quote unquote, how the, you know, the thoughts of the Tao are, or the mind of God is, using later missionary language, is manifesting itself in physical form. And so this interplay between the non-material and the material uses the word tong, that is also the main word for the I Ching, the Book of Change, the other important classic that precedes the creation of the Huangdi Neijing. Everything in our medicine is about tonging, to open up blocked meridians, but really in the end, the connection between microcosm and macrocosm, and the connection between invisible force energy transforming into physical matter and transforming back into the world of the invisible. So it's this interplay of non-matter and matter that the Chinese have described for thousands of years. And now things are changing in the Ming Dynasty as the first missionaries come into China. And here we already have a book published by the Jesuit missionaries Johann Schreck and Nicolas Longobardo called Renshen Tushuo, meaning an illustrated explication of the human body that is exclusively, using autopsies performed on dead bodies and describing basically the death structure of the human body, beginning of introduction of anatomy into China. We know from Song Dynasty reports that some of the earlier charts of structural charts of the organ systems were actually obtained by doing autopsies on the living body in like condemned criminals, for instance, that were literally cut open while they were still alive with a butcher's knife. So if at all the Chinese were interested in a map of the body, they were interested in a body that was still full with bioelectric energy, with qi, rather than in a body that was dead. Then we come into the Qing dynasty, where this was an important book. This was the most often published book, I think, from 1830 to 1850. This book was republished 40 times by Wang Qingren, who is considered one of the early reformers of Chinese medicine. He is by all means a very traditional person, but he published this book. He was an official who had access, who had heard about autopsies and had access to the morgue and would go there himself at night and cut open dead bodies because he wanted to see what they looked like in the inside. And so he wrote this book, Yiling Gai Cuo, correcting mistakes in the book, in the forest of medical books that came before him. And in there are these graphs that are more, still somewhat functional, but that are imitating these anatomical maps that look more like anatomical organs. And this is, I think, called Qinjian Gaizheng Zangfu Tu, which means the corrected anatomical Zangfu maps that I have seen with my own eyes. And fairly influential book. And later, of course, some people, his critics says, Yiling Gai Cuo Yu Gai Yue Cuo, the correcting mistakes in the medical forest. The more he corrects them, the more wrong it gets, because he had some very good formulas that we still use, including now during COVID, especially post-COVID. We have this. He was the founder also of the blood moving school, and particularly his remedy Xuefu Zhuyu Tang, drive out stasis in the mansion of blood decoction. I use right now in my clinic a lot for these microclotting phenomena post-COVID and also post-vaccination. We've observed that quite a lot. So the remedies are good, but his theory is more Western medicine. This then prompted some bizarre kind of phenomena, like this is a philosopher, Yu Zhengxie, also writing at about the same time, who had access to Wang Qingren's book, and he basically said, well, we can clearly see that there is a difference between, the ancient maps and the modern maps of the body, particularly those that the missionaries been bringing us. And so Chinese body is simply different from the Western body, and therefore we cannot believe in the Western God, because we have different organ structure that cannot contain as such. So it's just anthropologically, I thought, interesting here. The big event, of course, medicine and social politics and medical politics very much related. Here is the first Opium War in 1840, where the British, they dumped their goods in Shanghai and got a lot of people addicted. Lin Zexu was the commissioner, was dispatched to fight people back, which then prompted more repressive military action by the British. And from then on, part of the condition of the victoriously emerging British and other allies was that missionaries were allowed from now on, from 1840 on, to go freely into China. And a lot of the early missionaries were medical missionaries, establishing hospitals. And like Benjamin Hobson, for instance, Guangzhou was one of the first people. And they then also published books like this one, Quan Ti Xin Lun, a new treatise on the entirety of the human body structure that was trying, that the more and more of these kind of books were printed there in the late 1800s, having an influence on the consciousness of the doctors practicing both Chinese medicine, but also being trained in Western medicine now. Very few at the very beginning. Here is the second so-called reformer, Tang Rongchuan, of the so-called, since he wrote this book, 中西汇通易经经业, the essential meaning of the medical classics in the light of Chinese Western syncretism. So he wasn't exactly somebody who said Western Chinese medicine should be abolished, but he started paying more heed to the structure, but he also was saying, we've been able to view structure with the inner meditative eye thousands of years ago. Why do we need to butcher the human body? It's not going to tell us anything new. Nevertheless, he said more knowledge is always better. So he's often remembered as somebody who wanted to change Chinese medicine when he was actually more of a defender of the ancient energetic way of thinking. A very smart person, very knowledgeable at the time, very respected by his peers. Here now comes a very heavy hitter, completely forgotten nowadays. Oh, I'm sorry, I dropped the second character of his name there, Yu Yu. He, one of the most famous Confucian scholars at the time, who was a friend of, he was a colleague of Li Hongzhang's, took the examination with him, and was a favorite author of Kang Youwei. So the main ministers of the late Qing dynasty took him to be sort of a person to be looked up to, which caused him to be influential. In 1890, he wrote an essay called Fei Yi Lun, treatise on why we should abolish Chinese medicine. And he said Chinese medicine aligned with shamanism. Thousands of years ago, we already decided that shamanism was no good. Why didn't we also get rid of the rest of the medicine? And the kind of Confucius already said to stay away from medicines. Why can't we do that nowadays? And whether people take herbs or not, they'll get better by themselves, etc. So that was influential at the time, mostly through his students, who we will encounter in short order here, who were then very instrumental in the 1920s and 30s for a bunch of policies during the Republican period that were important for the fate of Chinese medicine in modern times. Most prominently, this person, Zhang Taiyan, who wrote also a treatise called Zhang Taiyan Yi Lun, the treatise on medicine by Zhang Taiyan, one of the most definitely better than his teacher, best remembered scholars of the time, who was, the reason why he hasn't been forgotten is because he was respected by both sides, because now we have like a split happening between the reformers and westernizers, and then medicine means the people who want to look at anatomy more and say everything that came before is wrong, and people will say, wait a minute, Chinese medicine is a completely different science, because he later also was one of the first presidents of the Shanghai College of Medicine. But in his early treatise there, that it became very, perhaps still is influential, he had chapters like on how the five phase elements are nonsense, how yin yang is nonsense, etc., and attempts to kind of equate Chinese concepts like the triple warmer with, for instance, the lymphatic system, which I think is partially true. Xiao Chai Hu Tang minor bepleurum decoction is certainly moving the lymph better than many other formulas, representative Shaoyang remedy, but it's not exclusively limited to that. He, furthermore, has even more influential students. We'll hear about them shortly. But yeah, so now we have another political event in the year 1900. There's the Boxer Rebellion, right? That was a siege of the foreign embassies in Beijing that was then relatively brutally repressed with public execution of the so-called Boxers by the Allied forces, which then allowed politically even more concessions, by the Qing government to foreign forces that could now operate even more open hospitals and churches and things like that. So that in 1902, we have a very interesting, kind of, but much forgotten treatise nowadays by a person who probably used a pseudonym, Meng Jin, wrote Yi, which is sort of a very funny kind of cartoon language for heal the doctors and the medicine which has fallen ill, meaning we need to heal our medicine and our doctors who all have gone crazy, who says most of today's Chinese medicine doctors are utterly ill-advised, tens of thousands of miles removed from the advanced craftsmanship of the ancient sages. As a result, the time-honored wisdom tradition of Chinese medicine that once studied the microcosm of the body before the sophisticated backdrop of all macrocosmic sciences has now become gone down majorly downhill, right? Because implied is here we just look at anatomy and think this is the cure-all when our medicine is all about energy. The next event that is important to remember is, of course, the fall of the last dynasty in 1911 and the establishment of the Republic, with the founder of the Republic being a Western-trained actually the very first graduate of a medical school in Hong Kong in 1887, Sun Yat-sen, Sun Zhongshan in Mandarin, who basically was the first president of the Republic, was a Western-trained medical doctor. Here we see some kind of anatomical drawing that are still preserved in some museum somewhere in Hong Kong. And so there was now a lot of political force and bias from that direction, from the Kuomintang government, to give ear to the reformers. The first notable event that I found were a major fight then broke out between the traditionalists and reformers was the Manchurian plague in Tianjin and north of there in 1911, where the British founded Da Gong Bao, sort of the equivalent of the New York Times at the time, that because of the director was French trained, Ying Lianzhi, the main editor, who was baptized, took the Christian name Vincentius, put the foreign name of the newspaper was L'Impartial, the impartial newspaper, which was everything but impartial here in this, Chinese medicine doctor basically treating this plague, the bubonic plague, and the that eventually killed more than 60,000 people at the time. And we had already Western people and Western trained physicians on the ground. And this newspaper was basically ridiculing Chinese medicine for trying and spreading rumors, saying they're just using the sole of sandals to boil those and have a few roots, and uses the worst of all was cat urine, uses cat urine, and made fun and said these Chinese doctors, they think because the plague is spread by mice or rats and cats is catching mice, therefore if we drink the urine of cats, then we can drink that and cure the plague. This was quickly debunked as being fake news by what this did was really cause the very angry Chinese doctors who were risking their lives in the front lines and were also dying to defend themselves, to organize themselves in unions and write letters to the newspaper every single day. And so that was sort of the beginning of this public argument that lasts until the current day. Another person who should be mentioned in connection with the Manchurian plague was Wu Liande, who we now know because the Nobel Committee in Sweden opened up their records, was the very first Chinese person ever proposed for a Nobel Prize. He didn't get it. I think Du Youyou was the first person there, possibly, for that artemisinin extraction for malaria in recent years. So Wu Liande was Western trained and was basically saying Chinese medicine is like a stone on the feet of medicine in general. It is kind of a kind of superstitious system that we better get rid of. Very influential person. He changed his mind, however, later when he wrote a history of medicine in China, and then discovered, because he of course wasn't a Chinese medicine doctor, he didn't really know what he was talking about in his early years. Once he looked deeper into it, he changed his tune in his later years, in the 1940s, I believe. And I think rightfully so, because this is like a partial list only of the monographs that were written from the Song Dynasty on all the way into the Qing Dynasty, exclusively on epidemic disease. So there's tremendous clinical records and also success stories, like in Shanghai, for instance, people during the plague were much more, according to the few records that we have, there were actually more people dying in the Western hospitalized concessions than in the outskirts where you had more Chinese, where people would exclusively go Chinese medicine doctors. So during the Manchurian plague, this was a sort of one of the counterpoints, writing to the newspaper, among them an article called Xin Mi Xin, saying the new superstition is this belief in external things like viruses and bacteria and things we see crawling around the microscope, that those kinds of things are causing disease, when from our perspective, it would be much more, what does our system do with those things? How come some people get super sick? We see that also with COVID, and others barely have a sniffle. So there are clearly other things at work there. So he was sort of an advocate, kind of led. He was the director of the, I think, the Tianjin Association of Chinese Medicine Doctors, and had a leadership role. In 1919, finally, we have the end of the First World War, with the Allied powers getting together in Versailles and divvying up territories in China among the victors without having China at the table, triggering massive protests in Beijing, particularly Beijing University students, and then triggering also a kind of new culture movement or so, including the Baihuawen movement, the kind of abolishment of not just Confucian values, but the old way of writing in Wenyanwen, but adopting spoken language in literature. And then with that, of course, comes also the more and more proposals to abolish the medicine, the old medicine of China. Here are sort of the main figures of that movement. That is sort of my original playground in the 1980s when I was originally a student of the literature of that time. We have Chen Duxiu, the founder of the Communist Party, on the very left, together with Hu Shi, the Columbia University trained and later also ambassador to the United States, also professor and president of Beijing University, and a lead person of that new culture movement. Very interesting, because Chen Duxiu is, of course, remembered as a person on the left. Hu Shi is remembered as a person on the right. Both of them somewhat persona non grata by the nowadays communist government, since Chen Duxiu aligned himself with Trotsky in his later years and was excluded. But nevertheless, they all shared what these people all share. We have Lu Xun, when I went to China in the 1980s, we all had to memorize that he was the #1 modern literature proponent and reflecting the suffering of the masses, etc. Tsai Yuanpei on the right, the president also for a time of Beijing University, famous reformer, and Li Dazhao, the second co-founder of the Communist Party, who then later got executed in the late 20s by some warlord. So, but what all these people had in common, they wanted to kind of see the new China thrive and execute like some major changes, and they all had major prejudice against Chinese medicine. Hu Shi, interestingly, got, after writing extensively about how this medicine doesn't do any good, but then when he got a kidney infection in Shanghai, I believe in the 1920s, that Western medicine couldn't cure, and he took Chinese herbs finally, and it went away in a few days. He then also kind of toned down his tune a bit. Lu Xun, of course, famous pioneer of modern writing, still held aloft as sort of the main representative of that time by universities in mainland China nowadays. He written a short story called Yao, where he was basically criticizing, like this superstitious peasant boy who was like dunking a mantou, a bun, into the blood of an executed prisoner to heal his tuberculosis. And so it was sort of an example of the ridiculousness of this medicine. Again, kind of using things that would never be used really in Chinese medicine. And it was, again, in later years where his wife had a major bleeding disorder that couldn't be helped by Western medicine, that was then cured by Chinese herbs, that he also stopped speaking out publicly against the efficacy of this medicine. Here is the person who's remembered as the #1, forgotten nowadays, but at the time he was called the #1 Zhongyi He, like the Chinese medicine blacklist person, who was Yu Yunxiu, who was born in the same year as Wu Liande and was a student of this this Confucian study master who's written that original criticism of Chinese medicine in the 1890s. So both he as well as Lu Xun were students of Zhang Taiyan. So it was like the Yu transmitting to Zhang Taiyan, transmitting to Lu Xun and Yu Yinxiu. And while Lu Xun was active in literature, very influential, of course, everybody read him at the time, still reads him. Yu Yinxiu was more of a politician, trained in Europe, who then came back and wrote this treatise, Ling Su Shang Dui, like an argument against the Huangdi Neijing and everything that's wrong with it. He is, of course, a Western medicine doctor. He found the ears of the Republican government at the time in the 1920s, especially the Chiang Kai-shek's deputy, Wang Jingwei, was, of course, a very colorful figure hanging out with Nazi politicians also, and then was regarded as a traitor later. And Chu Mingyi, though, who was also Western medicine doctor trained. So at this infamous conference on February 11, 1929, Wang Jingwei, who wasn't present in person, but who had said before, that Chinese medicine is all about yin and yang. They have no scientific basis. Therefore, I am in favor of getting rid of this ancient system altogether. And particularly people who don't have a license, which nobody had at the time. Chinese medicine was, now that Western medicine licensing was introduced, they were fighting hard to get licensing, the right to get a license, which required to have schools first that are accredited. And he was strongly against that. And then Chu Mingyi, who spoke at the conference together with Yu Yinxiu, was proposing that, and that bill went through, but immediately elicited dramatic reaction by Chinese medicine doctors, because you only have like a few hundred Western doctors there. You proposing to get rid of tens of thousands of doctors that serve the Chinese countryside successfully for the most part. And so there were lots of medical journals at the time that were founded to kind of argue these positions. Points here, by the way, a picture at the lower right is the delegation of Chinese medicine doctors that went to Beijing to plead their case and to please undo this bill. The main person who was active here as the spokesperson was this very intelligent doctor, scholar, physician, Yun Tietjiao. My colleague Volker Scheidt, anthropologist in London, has written a monograph about him. You can, and he translated some of his work. So he is, I think very clearly asserting what the problem is that I also see nowadays. He said sometime here during the 1930s or 20s, my humble opinion is that modern science appears to be always evolving. Yesterday's truth is today's falsehood. So we simply cannot claim that modern science is equivalent with the truth with a capital T. Western medicine contains numerous concepts that do not accurately reflect reality. This is my first assertion. Ultimately, of course, there's only one truth in the world. There are, however, many paths that are suitable to study this truth and produce similar outcomes. There should not just be just one method. Western science is not the only path of research. He does acknowledge that it does have its value, of course. Nobody, myself included, would argue against that. But Eastern medicine has its own valid perspective, particularly when it comes to energy, bioelectromagnetism, and functioning of the living body. And he says, therefore, the 5 organ systems described in the Neijing are not the 5 anatomical organs, but 5 networks reflecting the 4 seasonal transformations. This was further mirrored by Peng Ziyi, completely forgotten for a long time. He was a bi-minority doctor who published his own, who taught students originally at the Qing Medical Academy, and then during the Republican period as well. And this is an excerpt from his own textbook that he only wasn't published, he just gave it to his own students, called 原运动的古中医学, the ancient Chinese medicine that's based on circular motion. So he says the study of Chinese medicine is the study of the microcosm of the human body. The original study of the human body as a microcosmic reflection was abandoned because the way of understanding the universe was lost, and with it, the way of understanding Chinese medicine. Owing to this deficiency, the true method for researching the body of Chinese medicine changed. The result has been progressive movement further and further from its root. The only remedy for this deviation is to rediscover the true method of researching Chinese medicine. The result of such a method is to immediately grasp the macrocosm, or I'm assuming the science of the macrocosm that underlies the study of the human body. If one grasps the macrocosmic knowledge naturally, they or we will also grasp the fundamental principles of Chinese medicine. Brian, my colleague and friend Brian McMahon, translated this. He also has a monograph on that. The interesting thing is that Peng Ziyi, while not that famous at his time, only known to his student, is now famous again because his textbook got into the hands of Li Ke in the late 1940s, who himself got rediscovered by Liu Lihong, who, as we will see shortly, wrote this book, 思考中医, Rethinking Chinese Medicine, in 2002, which then became modern China's best-selling book of nonfiction book and influenced millions of people, literally. And through it, then, Li Ke found him, and Liu Lihong was impressed by the older doctor's knowledge and helped Li Ke to publish this book that Peng Ziyi's and included some other things. So was republished in 2005 or so, and is starting to influence modern Chinese medicine thinkers again. Another person important at the time and remembered until the present time, I've translated some of his essays, is Zhang Xichun, considered after Tang Rongchuan and the Yilin Gaicuo author Wang Qingren, the third reformer of the medicine, who was really once again an advocate for Chinese medicine, but completely not averse to absorbing and integrating Western and Eastern medicine, but from a Chinese, that is, energetic perspective. So he wrote this book, 医学中中参西路, Chinese at heart, but Western were appropriate, essays investing in integrated form of medicine that had featured interesting things like making a materia medica of Western drugs, like quinine, for instance, that existed at that time, or aspirin or so, and then classifying that like a Chinese herb. Is it cooling? Is it warming? What meridians does it go into? And then even make remedies that combine Western drugs and Chinese herbs, like aspirin jia shi gao tang, aspirin plus gypsum decoction, for instance. So very interesting thinker, very modern, and we talk a lot about integrative medicine 100 years later now. but I think we are still not at his level, because we nowadays just using the material lens to look at phenomena of energy, which is from an ancient perspective, hierarchically on a higher level. And so that's what he did. He used the traditional Chinese medicine philosophy to examine Western medicine phenomena and knowledge base, and then describing, utilizing techniques of Western medicine from a Western Chinese medicine perspective. So reinterpretation, therefore, of what is Chinese medicine, not using Chinese drugs, but anything, I use Chinese medicine philosophy to prescribe something, including Western drugs, makes me a Chinese medicine physician, rather than me using Western medicine knowledge, like biochemical knowledge of an herb, and prescribe it based on that, actually would make me a Western medicine physician, even though I'm using Chinese herbs. And that is mostly what is happening a lot nowadays. So it behooves us to rethink how we define integrative medicine, particularly in relationship to Chinese medicine. I have a lot to learn from Zhang Xichun. So now, of course, we have Mao Zedong coming along, who by now in the 30s and 40s taken leadership of the Communist Party. Li Daozhao is dead. Chen Duxiu is fallen to the wayside as a Trotskyist. And he goes on this long march in a civil war, Republican and Communist Party. He has his own little kingdom in northern China, in Yan'an, and he is, among other things, determined to uproot what he called shamanic superstitions and establish model public health villages, meaning based on Western medicine, in Yan'an, in the area he governs. His biggest collaborator in that area is Norman Bethune, a Canadian physician who is to this day still remembered as sort of like best friend of the Communist Party. So if you go to China and you from Europe or the United States or Australia, and say you involved in medicine, they all call you, oh, Bai Chuan, you are the second coming of Bai Chuan, kind of thing. But then once he got into power in 1949, right, the establishment of the People's Republic of China goes 1949, he changes his tune, because he is now ruling over a huge country that has hundreds of millions of people, and that has only very few Western medicine doctors and infrastructure, even though the Russians start supplying China with goods and medicines at the time. But he has all of these different quotations here where he is saying, this is part of our culture and we need to support this. However, he always says we need to do it the right way, which means it needs to happen under the auspices of Western science or modern science, or basically scientific materialism, which is what Marxist and later Maoist materialism was adhering to, right? The belief in the material world, religion, or anything invisible, such as qi is the opium of the people. So there is that idea. So he said in 1953, right, he says the concepts like the 5 elements are unreasonable, whereas if you talk about things like the brain and the cell and bacteria, that is scientific. And so there is already the seed for this Chinese medicine, yes, but integration only from the perspective of a Western medicine structural model of the body perspective. And so he established not only the first Chinese medicine colleges, first in Chengdu, then in Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou and Nanjing in 1956. He demonstratively took Chinese herbs in 1957 at the beginning of the Great Leap Forward, when he fell ill and had this reported in the newspapers to set a good example, and then made this famous calligraphy that's still in a lot of books nowadays. 中医药学是一个伟大的宝库，应当努力发掘加以提高。So Chinese medicine is an important treasure house of our culture. It should be actively developed and further evolved. Of course, this includes, it's like under the auspice, we need to look at it from the perspective of Western science and make it more scientific. And that, unfortunately, as we now know, has done more harm than good. And so in the 2 years from 1958 to 1960, he gave the missive to launch this 中西医结合 movement, the Chinese Western medicine integration movement, which primarily involved to have up to, in the beginning 2000, but by 1960, 36,000 Western trained physicians took a year or two off to study Chinese medicine. And while only 10% of them completed the course, because none of them could kind of get warm with what they didn't believe in the first place, but all of these people became officials in the Ministry of Health. And we're from now on overseeing development of Chinese medicine that they thought that they understood, but did not really understand or believe in, and had immense prejudice in that. So within a few years, the Chinese medicine curriculum at these freshly founded colleges was 2 years Western medicine education only. So you basically sort of quote unquote brainwashing the student into a medicine that is based on structure of the body with anatomy and biochemistry first, and then yin yang 5 element, basically the symbolic capturing of energy classification second. And so within a few years, medicine, the quality of the medicine in the clinic was going so far down the drain that some senior physicians who were still, of course, trained in much earlier before these new colleges were established, including famous luminaries like Qinbo Wei and Ren Yingqiu, a lot of them, 3 out of the 5 of them coming from Sichuan, which has always been sort of a cradle of traditionalism. They wrote on the eve of the graduation at Beijing University, they got together and wrote this letter that's remembered as Wu Lao Shangshu. And even now we have a statue in front of Beijing University that remembers this event. The 5 elders deliver in upward direction their complaints. And they said, we need to study Chinese medicine first, the first 2 years, and use our energetic system before people then learn structure, and use that as sort of a reference tool rather than as their basis. So in 1963, for 1 year only, this new curriculum is being established, but then already the next year, there's the cultural evolution is on the horizon, and all education is abolished altogether. So we basically only have like 1 year where this new curriculum was executed. And my teacher, Deng Zhongjia, who passed away earlier this year, who was, until his death, the leading expert in the theory of Chinese medicine and formula studies, influenced myself also deeply, and told me, because he was when I studied with him in 1990 to 92, he at his kitchen table 1-on-1, I went there every single day, had the tremendous privilege to study with this incredibly brilliant person who had been, during the Cultural Revolution, after graduation, been dispatched to a leper colony for 7 years, healed all the lepers there, and then had 5 years of free time to just read the classics, and then particularly the pre-medical classics, and establish his life work, basically hearkening back to these people I've mentioned earlier, how Chinese medicine is based on the culture of the Han Dynasty and before, which looks at the science of the macrocosm first. And then he said, I'm talking to you one-on-one like this. This is the real Chinese medicine. I'm the dean of the school. I cannot teach like this in class because I have a standardized textbook, and we are not allowed to veer away from this textbook. And so I'm hoping you will found a school once you go back, and then once that becomes successful abroad, then since we people in China are always interested in what's successful abroad, then we'll re-import it back to here. And so this was that planted a seed somehow. It wasn't the only reason, but I did, after I went back, found a school in '92, named it specifically the College of Classical Chinese Medicine at National University of and Natural Medicine in Portland. And that then started cooperating with proponents of classical Chinese medicine movement in China itself. So those were very formative years for myself, but I also see in retrospect how important the example of Deng Zhongjia was, not just for me, but long before other people in writing were putting these thoughts in writing. He was teaching that, at least in Chengdu, and putting that into his books. Mao Zedong in 1965, of course, in the middle now of the Cultural Revolution, he he changes his tune again. He doesn't veer away from Chinese medicine, but basically says it doesn't need to be so complicated. We need to be able to teach it in 2 weeks, and established the Barefoot Doctor movement, where it says medical education needs to be reformed. It's completely unnecessary to engage in so much studying. How many years of formal education, after all, did Hua Tuo have? How many Li Shuzhen? And so he says, the real learning will happen during actual practice. And no matter what, it'll always be better than the charlatan shamans, and the peasants will be able to afford such care. Studying is a stupid endeavor, he says, for a doctor. So that then brought this simplification into the medicine that still exists to the present day. You can take a look at the doctoral curriculum of TCM university curricula, both in the United States as well as in China itself, that are basically based on this handbook of Barefoot Doctor, simplified approach to yin yang, 5 elements, and certain remedies that should be used. But literally, there's this curriculum that's now been blown up to a 4-year study. Doctoral studies was originally meant to be taught to people in 2 or 3 weeks. Right, the 赤脚医生运动, the Barefoot Doctor movement. Manfred Porker, the sinologist from University of Munich, already in the 1970s, pointed out that Chinese medicine is a science in its own right, that don't need validation. That was super popular at the time by Western medicine, was in a certain way pioneering. He established the Societas Medicinae Sinensis in Munich that still exists to the present day. And then, and I owe this to how Deng Zhongjia taught me at his kitchen table. You know, he says then in the 80s and 90s, you have this kind of pseudo integration happening, how we are grasping, you know, system science and cybernetics and information theory, and putting it over Chinese medicine to legitimize it, since the, you know, spatially more and more that the profession is now, after the Cultural Revolution, people are back in school, and what was a bachelor degree becomes a master's degree, becomes a doctoral degree. It becomes more and more evolved. The students become more and more. A lot of the universities now have 30,000 students, but he already said this is, like sort of the problems now as much as before is that we have people in charge who don't really understand the medicine, make political decisions about its future. So Liu Binghui, one of its early directors at the ministry, later, once he wasn't minister anymore, but still very well respected and now could speak more freely, wrote in 1990 that he says, in recent years, the unique characteristics of Chinese medicine, its advantages over Western medicine, its standards of academic excellence have not been developed according to the wishes of the people, but have been tossed into a state of severe crisis, etc. And the primary expression of this crisis is the Westernization of all guiding principles and methodologies of Chinese medicine. This prompted another writing by now the 8 elders, well, led by this man, Deng Tietao, a magnificent man. He only died a few years ago at the age of 103, together with other, at the time, important people like Fang Yaozhong, for instance, wrote once again a letter to the government demanding certain political changes in unison with Liu Binghui. I visited Deng Tietao later, in 2006. He was way into his 90s at the time, or just a very remarkable man. He was also the main person who used Chinese medicine successfully to fight the SARS epidemics in 2002, and did not lose a single person while in Hong Kong in the hospital and the Western Hospital in Guangzhou. Many dead people in the emergency ward. In his ward, he did not lose a single physician or patient to SARS. So he showed that clinically, this really works. Not just it's an elegant way of looking at the nature, but Chinese medicine really works in the clinic. Here, some other influential teachers of mine, Dr. Zheng Rongxiu, who was master of the pulse, who studied with Dr. Qian Heming, who is here on the lower left, who saw up to 400 patients a day by just feeling the pulse. They didn't want to hear, what disease do you have? What kind of pulse, of course, is the most direct way to feel the energy of a patient. So also one time I might have relayed before in my first lecture, he healed somebody of cancer. He didn't even know the patient had cancer. The patient just wanted some pain relief, and then told him 2 years later that taking his medicine had taken his seemingly, he'd been told he only has a few months to live, cancer away. So that is sort of a different approach of this medicine and sort of the kind of mentors I had. Dr. Wang, the Taoist professor of Taoist medicine and nourishing life practices, my Qigong teacher, who is is 85 right now, studied in the 1940s with the main luminaries of martial arts and Kung Fu at the time. This was his main teacher here, Li Dao, and had to hide everything he knew during the Cultural Revolution, had to practice in secret, and was finally discovered during a military competition of folk healers, was called to a professorship in Chengdu, became healer of famous authors and athletes, Olympic athletes. That's how I met him in 92. He didn't have many Chinese disciples at all at the time, because that was sort of taboo as sort of a remnant of traditional culture to be in discipleship, old style, with a master of Qigong. And so he, for the most part, just had foreign students. Every year from 1994 on, we would go there until recently, before the pandemic. And now, eventually, he visited our school many times, is still a respected advisor there, helped establish the Qigong curriculum at the school. And through him, one of his early disciples was Liu Lihong, who is, of course, by now has become the main voice of the pre-TCM modernized, structuralized Western medicine view, and established the, after he'd become famous, the Institute for the Clinical Research of Classical Chinese Medicine at Guangxi University of TCM. But this year was still, he was not famous at all. This was the first trip in '99, where we not only had Professor Wang teach Qigong, he was teaching the Shanghan Lun to us. And this person on the left, who was a colleague of his, Dr. Zhang Jun, brought a tape recorder. And so all of his 2-week-long lectures were recorded. And then afterwards, when he had a grant, he wrote it up in a book, and he was speaking to foreigners. So he was speaking off the cuff, completely, in the vernacular, no bars, no holding back. And he found a publisher who was well connected and was able in 2003 publish Zhikao Zhongyi, which became overnight an immediate success. We worked 10 years on it to finally, a few years ago, translate that, bring it out as a classical Chinese medicine published by Hong Kong University Press. But in China itself, it sold over 1 million copies and became the most best-selling nonfiction book in China for 20 years running, or at least 10 years or so. And Liu Lihong then became a famous spokesperson, is probably still the most famous spokesperson of the cause of classical Chinese medicine in modern times. So he says lots of things in his books, but he, again, of course, is lamenting. He says we are losing the clinical, not just the elegance of our medicine becomes rote memorization and boring, but is clinically we're losing our power because we're using this Western medicine structural lens to determine what is right about our medicine and what is wrong. And the deeper meaning gets thrown out like the baby with the bathwater. And I'm still collaborating with him. So we kind of back and forth, like this whole movement inspiring people in China, inspiring us going back to China, co-teaching together. So I feel extremely privileged to be part of what by now is really a international movement. I will, just show this briefly because we've reached the end of our time, but I want you to be able to look at these translations later once it's up on the website. So after then the dam broke, everybody, this was nothing new anymore. Liu Lihong in 2003 publishes this book. Now everybody else is coming out of the woodwork and has similar things to say, including this very good book, Zheyan Kan Zhongyi, looking at Chinese medicine through the philosopher's lens, right? So he says, we need to revitalize Chinese medicine. We need to bring about a renaissance of the medicine. We need to save Chinese medicine. For how many decades have we been shouting these slogans, and how many administrative measures have been passed to support, to protect, etc., the field of Chinese medicine? But here we are years later, and I say it's again 20 years later, this is still the debate in our field. And these never-changing questions are still there. What is science? Is Chinese medicine a science? If Chinese medicine is a science, what type of science is it? If it's not a science, then what is it, etc. So these are all things I found very, translation worthy. You can read that on your own time. Xi Jinping, since he's come to power, has supported Chinese medicine. He sees himself obviously as a second coming of Mao Zedong. He's using the same language that Mao Zedong uses for supporting Chinese medicine, which is always under the auspices of Western medicine, of real science. So not too much has changed there. And one can see that, well, Professor Wang, for instance, has been able to have more disciples in China now because it's patriotic now to study these traditional things. There is strict censorship with his latest book, and a movie about his life of his teacher wasn't allowed to come out. So there is, it's, these two things go hand in hand. Super strict control more than before, with overall policies that encourage Chinese medicine. And so in conclusion, here's another thing that's truly true that Li Zhichong wrote in 2002, where he says, even though the outer shell of Chinese medicine education is still there, the tall buildings, the books and the students and the instructors, and the herbs that fill the markets in abundance, the real science of our medicine, especially the true essence of our theoretical foundation, has been lost almost in its entirety, or has become little more than an empty slogan. So this is, I couldn't say it better myself. That's why I list this here. And here, look at these are the tall buildings, you know, more than ever. Nanjing on the lower right, Shanghai University of Chinese Medicine on the upper right, Chengdu on the left, huge universities with lots of funding, but all of the research is Western medicine, research of Chinese medicine and structure and biochemical analysis of Chinese herbs, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, I want to give the word to you and want to thank you very much for your time and attention here, and want to see whether there are some questions here. Larson, should we encourage people to just turn on their microphone and start to, okay.
If you want, go ahead.
Heiner, hi. How you doing, my dear friend?
I'm doing great, Zeph. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it.
You mentioned recently that Dr. Liu Hong seemed to be under a lot of pressure and tension. I was wondering if you were able openly to speak about that and what's going on with him and his work at the present time.
He was one of the first people probably inspired by the example of Deng Tietao to go to Wuhan during the coronavirus epidemic. It was difficult for him to go in there all dressed up in astronaut suits, 3 pairs of gloves, giving acupuncture to people, having no herbs available at the moment. But so thanks to him, we had some of the early reports that Chinese medicine, just like for SARS, works. Right. It is, I can't confirm that. I haven't, you know, he got very exhausted during that time. It was a lot of stress, not only, you know, being there, but so high expectations, and him then immediately having to lecture from quarantine later. But I think more importantly, he has his own continuing education business now that he's retired, called Tungyo Sanhe, very influential. There are usually 50 to 70,000 people listening online. I'm lecturing there myself the day after tomorrow. So there are probably, and I haven't discussed that with him, so if that is not true, I want to make it clear that this is not coming from him. But since you're asking, there is, you know, there is a lot of stress if you are operating as a private citizen who all of a sudden becomes very prominent. Like I mentioned, the book of Dr. Wang Xingyu was allowed to republish his book, which prompted me to get to know him in the first place from 1990. But all of the pictures had to be taken out. His autobiography and the story of his teacher had to be taken out because Chinese medicine, yes, personality cult, no. So that is always this fear that every dynasty has fallen in a certain way, particularly with these kind of Taoist religious movements. And, that's why all of the Zhang Hongbao and Yan Xin had to flee in the 1990s. And also, of course, the most famous example is the Falun Gong guy, right? Because it's this fear of the Chinese government that as a singular person, your voice has more power than that of the party. And I know that
paranoia seems pretty widespread these days.
Yeah, and so as part of the public corruption campaign, the government has arrested quite a few people in recent years, including the field of Chinese medicine. So I'm sure, and again, he hasn't said that, but I'm sure that if I was him, I would feel tremendous emotional pressure of needing to speak my truth. He recently told me, you watched that too, during the symposium we had at our school, that I don't want to speak about things that I don't feel are right, that are not right, or that I don't feel in my heart, including about the theory of Chinese medicine. I don't want to just talk about some 5-element theory or something I don't really necessarily understand myself. It's just what others say. I only want to talk about what moves me in my heart at the present time. So only then I can transmit. And so with on one side having all of these people who are paying to listen to him, and on the other hand have literally government censors sitting in his class listening to every word and giving him feedback later, that would give me, knowing him, who is a truth seeker and a very spiritual person, that's enough to break my heart just thinking about that. So
people
my
like
heart goes out to him.
Like yourself and myself and Dr. Liu, we suffer when there's political intrigues or ego games going on, and in being able to speak what's truthful. Well, anyway, I want to wish you great success with the Healing Center, and really hope to come up to visit sometime and see how things are progressing along sooner than later, I hope.
You're welcome anytime. Looking forward to your next visit. What else do we have? Do we have another question? Please just boldly turn on your microphone and shout away.
Well, if no one else is jumping in, perhaps I will ask a question. First of all, thank you so much. This was a wonderful history lesson and a real good overview of how we got to where we are now. And I think the part that we're building to, the question after a history is, where do we go from here? And when I think about comparative projects, whether it's we're comparative philosophy, comparative religion, comparative literature, or now talking about comparative medicine in a way, one of the tensions is always how to keep what's currently sort of the dominant theory from then shaping the narrative of and becoming the lens that's controlling the other thing that is being compared. And that's part of the problem I sense from this, with approaching Chinese medicine from this lens of Western medicine, and the structure of the body is determined by Western medicine and disease and so forth. How would you propose? Do you have idea? I mean, obviously you probably have a lot in a small piece. Flipping that narrative to maybe starting from a Chinese medicine perspective to bring knowledge about Western medicine, change that kind of comparison.
Yeah, Larson, thank you so much for such a pertinent question. I mentioned a little bit, but maybe this gives me opportunity to flesh it out a little bit more. We are basically using sort of when we approach Chinese medicine, including the West, meant to end, of course, not just with these fancy buildings in China, but also in the Chinese medicine we have imported in mostly TCM Western science form, right? We have in this country the privilege that we have up to doctoral, Chinese medicine from a certificate of 2-year studies in the 1970s after Nixon's visit to then master degree in the 1980s to now doctoral degree in the 2000 status, essentially being on the same level as physical therapists and osteopaths and chiropractors and naturopaths. That is great, but licensing, all of that is great. We might not have the gleaming buildings quite yet, and the schools are still small in the West, but we have 72 or so schools, accredited schools of Chinese medicine. That is tremendous, but only about 10% of them are pursuing in their teaching this kind of overtly energy-based, what I call classical Chinese medicine lens, and using that lens to also learn Western medicine. So it is part of the accreditation, including for our school, that you need to have a minimum of 486 or so hours of Western medicine studies. And that includes anatomy, pharmacology, physiology, things like that. And at other schools, you literally have a Western medicine doctor who knows nothing about Chinese medicine, for the most part, come in and just lecture like they would teach at a Western medicine university. Whereas we've made a concerted effort, not just only teach the Chinese medicine classes, but also even these classes from a perspective of symbolism, which I explained a little bit in the what is symbolism? In this lecture on the brief history of Qi, symbolism is an attempt to translate energy into structure in symbolic form by using things like the 5 elements to express the momentum of particular movements in nature. And so we mostly then use graduates of our program that include MDs that have a superb knowledge of the anatomical and biochemistry record, but then can look at that record instead of using that record and superimposing it on an energetic system and throwing out 90% of it in the barefoot doctor model and saying that's just a bunch of hooey, because we don't know whether that's true. You can't touch that, but the biochemistry of the herbs is true. There is a story I should mention here. I still remember that Deng Zhongjia told me at the kitchen table, where he said, I was in the countryside in my leper colony. The lepers had left. I mostly had Tibetan patients who would come from me primarily to have healthy childbirth, because most women die from, when there's no hospital from during childbirth. And so they would come from me from hundreds of miles away, because there was no Western medicine hospital that could perform cesareans, to take this remedy, Wuyosan, no worry powder from the Ming Dynasty. And I found that was working really well in preparing for especially first-time mothers to have healthy births. And all of these people were doing propaganda saying this really works, you should take that. So they would all come, and I was finally contacted by this pharmaceutical company that said, we hear you have this great remedy. Are you willing to do this research, like go through this procedure of making a drug out of that, like a cheng yao, right? In China, you can make legal drugs with claims out of Chinese medicine. And he said, sure, great. And then they said, well, we need to have animal experiments and human experiments. And so they then reported and said, I have a piece of good news and bad news. We dissected a rabbit. We operated the rabbit. We put his uterus on the table. We injected your drug into the uterus of the rabbit, but there was no evidence of any kind of contraction. And therefore, we conclude from the perspective of evidence-based science that nothing is happening, that this is actually doesn't work after all. And then they were injecting, though, while the rabbit was out there, they were injecting other kind of plan B, plan C, some other kind of folk remedy that was a single herb that you wouldn't really use from a perspective of classical Chinese medicine to induce labor or to prepare somebody for labor. And it induced spasms. So they thought, okay, this will work. They took it to the next level. And then in the human trials, it did nothing for the mother. So then they abandoned the whole project. So this is sort of an example. He told that to me as an example, how making something integrated by superimposing structuralist science, biochemistry, on a system that is primarily functional will produce absurd results that don't work in the clinic. And so what we've then trying to do is to kind of learn as much Western medicine as we can, but look at the incredibly interesting phenomena of the biochemistry of the cell, especially in symbolically, energetically, what does that tell us? What hormone or what kind of process in the cell belongs to metal? What belongs to wood? What belongs to the large intestine? What belongs to the liver? And then describe it from that perspective, and then even start classifying, like Zhang Xichun did, Western drugs through that lens. For instance, antibiotics are energetically cooling from that perspective, like a Yangming drug. And if somebody really has excess heat in the stomach, antibiotics should be a lifesaver. But if they're really a tie-in constitutional type, they're cold in the spleen and damp, then immediately there will be even more spleen Qi deficient or yang deficient, and we'll get thrush and diarrhea and other signs of a spleen cold and damp. And that's precisely what happens with a lot of antibiotic patients. So we are trying to sort of use Zhang Xichun's method of using Chinese Western medicine details as sort of as a reference tool, learn as much as we can, and not ideologically be exposed to it, but look at it and incorporate it through the lens of Chinese medicine, energetic science, and the symbolic description that we learn in our foundational studies or so, rather than the other way around. That is sort of trying to put your amazing and really to the point question here, give sort of the best I could do in a few minutes or so.
It's a student at one of the schools contacted me about, they were supposed to write a critique of an RCT on Xuanza Rentan, which is a famous Chinese herbal formula from the Shanghanza Binglun. And it was a study of 185 patients. They were with insomnia. So first of all, as everyone knows, there's so many different qualitative breakdowns of insomnia. There's a person with trouble falling asleep, staying asleep. Is it irregular? You know, it's so many different things, and there's so many different possible causative factors and patterns. So this study had reduced it to just one formula treating insomnia. And then one Chinese, what we call Zongfu pattern, viscera bowel pattern, which was liver, kidney, yin blood vacuity deficiency. And every patient was categorized. It's not even really a pattern differentiation. It's more of a Jing, of a typecasting of a group of patients. And then giving this formula to all 185 patients, conveniently choosing a Zongfu pattern, which probably a majority of the patients didn't even have. They probably were not diagnosed via pulse tongue in questioning. And then coming up with these numbers, how many responded this way, that way, and so forth, which I think was highly arbitrary. And probably the numbers were, shall we say, they made to look good when, you know, that kind of approach doesn't work in Chinese medicine, but this is what we're up against: a formula for insomnia, a formula for stomach pain, a formula for this one, even with herbal medicine in these studies. And they don't do our medicine much good. But as Heiner says, going the other direction, we can deconstruct other methodologies, people taking supplements, vitamins, medications, and we could see how they affect the total picture, because a Chinese medical doctor does look at the whole picture and everything that the patient is doing and participating in their life and in their health and in the treatments that they get. So definitely want to second that with Heiner.
Very well said, Zeph. Another thing that came to mind when you were talking is in response to Larson's question is in one of the Wing's commentaries attributed to Confucius, whether he really wrote that or not, we don't know, to the I Ching, to the Book of Change, it says something like, if you look at this book with the eyes of wisdom, you will see nothing but wisdom. If you look at it through the eyes of compassion, you will see nothing but love. But that implies, if you look at this book from the perspective of materialism, of a materialism, which is a very crude perspective, using here words that were used by some of the earlier doctors I introduced today, then you will see nothing but crude Stone Age people with a crude consciousness who didn't know what they were talking about. And then we get bizarre things like, I think one of the fundamental modern books about Egyptian medicine and the Eber Papyrus was written by an anthropologist in the, very decorated person, can't think of his name right now, in the 1990s, where he said, the Egyptians are saying that there are 12 pipelines through which air circulates in the human body. And you look at that from the perspective of Chinese medicine, you know immediately that the Egyptians had their own equivalent of the 12 meridians, in which qi, which also in Chinese can mean air, can mean energy, can mean information, circulates. And but he was like making fun as the supposedly impartial anthropologist, historian, observer, really having not only materialist but imperialist glasses on and saying, these are basically, they built the pyramids, but they were ridiculous Stone Age barbarians. And it took until, we already knew that the Romans kind of opened up the blood vessel of a dog and knew that there was blood circulating and it wasn't air. And I mean, very clearly the Egyptians were smart. They understood the physical body, but they were describing something else. And so we are still at that time when we looking at these ancient cultures. Liu Lihong always says that. Why don't we understand these cultures? Because 2, 3, 4,000 years later, our consciousness hasn't evolved to that place yet where we fully understand what is it that these people actually are talking about. And so we just make an assumption with a very limited lens, and then writing books about that then in some instances, like the two extreme examples I mentioned, can lead to absurd conclusions that, particularly in the clinic, then don't lead to the opposite, namely they don't work. But we've gone a bit over here, Larson. I apologize, but it was sort of a lively discussion here. So thank you for your questions. I have guests though at home here and need to bow out. So with your
thank you
permission,
again for this fantastic lecture today and answering these difficult questions in such a wonderful manner. And thank you to everyone for being here today and joining us. And we hope to see you at the next event too. So thank you again, Dr. Fruhauf.
Very much.
Before we log off, could I ask one quick question? Oh, is he gone?
Sorry, I think he had to run.
Yeah, is there any way I could email him? I was just asking because there's a lot of misconceptions around Chinese medicine. I was wondering kind of what his biggest lesson learning, kind of battling all those misconceptions, within
That's a
teaching.
good question. I think you can, if you forward your question to, I think Anne Heyrman-Hart put her email in earlier, or you can send it to me. It's just my name, Larson_DFury@brown.edu, and I can forward it on to Dr. Fruhauf as well.
Great, thank you.
I'm happy to help out. You can send the question to me as well.
Great, thank you.
Take care, everyone.